I'd like to welcome everyone. My name is Blair Rubel, and I'm director of the Comparative Urban Studies Project here at the Wilson Center. Our speakers have been very disciplined. We're sitting up here like in one of those presidential debates where there's a live mic, so everybody's afraid to say anything. But we'll use those live mics to our advantage in a little bit. As people are settling in, I want to mention that we have our program has another event Thursday, the 18th of December from 3 to 5. Neil Pierce will be speaking about his new book, Century of the City, No Time to Lose. This event is actually, we're being quite opportunistic. We have been cooperating with the Fetzer Institute on a program on resilient communities, and my colleague from the Fetzer Institute, Mark Nepo, will tell you a little bit about that project and our hopes for that project. But it seemed to us that there were so many remarkable people coming to Washington to participate in that meeting that we wanted to give an opportunity for a larger audience to hear them. And one of the really fascinating aspects of the program with Fetzer is that we have people literally from around the world, and we do have representatives of different continents here. I think the one point that has emerged from the private discussions is that the challenges of communities in an era of global transformation and uncertainty know no boundaries. And we could have a different selection of people here representing only the global north, only the global south. We've tried to mix it up a little bit, but clearly we've entered a period in which the question of the meaning of community, how communities can nurture meaning and opportunity, these are challenges which are faced everywhere around the world. And it's a particular pleasure for me to be moderating a meeting that has so many people from different parts of the world who have made tremendous contributions to their communities. I am now going to turn the floor over to Mark Nepo, who will explain more about the larger project. I'm not going to dwell on biographies. The information handout is available outside the room. From here on out, basically all I'm going to do is to identify speakers, and I'm sure very quickly you'll figure out why they're worth listening to. And the first speaker will be Mark Nepo, Program Officer from the Fetzer Institute.
Thank you, Blair, and good afternoon. We are delighted to be partnering with the Wilson Center, and we are working on a 3-year inquiry that's centered on revitalizing communities within and across boundaries. And I'd like to first acknowledge gratitude for this partnership, and especially to Lee Hamilton and Mike Van Duzen for receiving this initial idea more than a year ago, very enthusiastically, and so we've been planning for this for quite some time. And we did, as Blair said, complete the first of 3 international seminars over the next 3 years, and a trilogy of books as well as web materials will come out of that. And our whole intent is to seed meaningful dialogue and action in a growing community. So in a way, we hope that this community of inquiry will become a resilient community. And I also want to acknowledge through the real care and excellence of the Wilson Center how this has all come off beautifully, particularly to Blair and Allison Garland and Lauren Herzer, who've done tremendous work. And to echo what Blair said, this has been a truly international gathering. We have 23 scholars and practitioners from 11 countries, representative of South America, North America, Africa, Indo-Southern Asia, and Russia. And I hope I didn't leave anything out. We didn't have anybody from Antarctica. But their experience and insight and participation have truly been compelling and exceptional. So to give you a sense of of the conversations we've been having, and the reason we're having these forums is we're committed to having the conversations and the inquiries go public and extend the ring of conversation. So we will have folks speak from their lives and their stories, and then we're going to open up to have question and answer and dialogue here. So we can continue that. But to give you a sense of what the ground we've been looking into together, I want to just give you some of the questions we've been looking at over the last few days, some of which we brought into the group, and some of which the group brought to us. How do different cultures around the world describe and define resilience? In what situations is resilience transformative? And in what situations is resilience a bouncing back to an untenable situation or life? What might be successful examples of community resilience, and how can such examples shift global consciousness away from fear and violence? What key elements need to be present for community betterment to take place? How do local communities promote urban inclusion and reconciliation? What policies would stimulate self-organizing communities to help people become their best? What might the role of the individual be in community transformation, and the reverse, the community in individual transformation? And finally, how can governance structures and policies aimed at promoting democratic civic culture create a common sense of belonging and foster such resilience in an increasingly globalized world? So without taking up any more time, I'd like to turn it back to Blair and again welcome you. Thanks for coming.
Thank you, Mark. As Mark explained, what we've asked is because there are so many compelling stories represented by the group we've gathered, we've asked some of the members of the larger group to tell you about their stories for about 10 minutes each, more or less, and then we'll open it up for an extended discussion. And first we'll hear from Arif Hasan, who is advisor to the Irangi Pilot Project and founder and chairman of the Urban Resource Center in Karachi.
Well, first of all, I'm very thankful to the Woodrow Wilson Center and the Institute for having invited me. It's been an extremely rich 2 days that I have spent here and learned a lot of new words, concepts, and a new way of looking at the work that I have been doing in Karachi and elsewhere. I was going to talk about the projects I work with, but I was told that I should talk about myself as well. So I'll try and put the two things together. I was born in Delhi, in India. At the age of 4, migrated to Karachi, where I have lived ever since, apart from the period that I studied abroad. I studied in the UK, I studied architecture, worked in Europe for some time and went back home. The period that I went back home was a period of considerable turmoil and political upheaval. And so, like young men at that time, I became a part of it. And I think a lot of what I did subsequently had a lot to do because I became a part of that political movement and thinking. But really, I was trained conventionally. But that conventional training went out of the window when a community whom I was advising in a development project was evicted. That was my first questioning of the land issue and how it operated and how unjust and unfair it was. Soon after that, in another location, in a rural area, where I knew people because of childhood associations, there was another big rural eviction. So these two things, I think, brought about a big change in my life, although at that time I had a sizable architectural practice. And my involvement in these issues related to land, its ownership, community struggles, they increased. And I wrote more and more about this. And subsequently, a major inner city project that was taking place in my city, a very unjust and unequitable project, I challenged it. And I think that brought me into the forefront of the sort of work that I do now. And then I was asked to teach. And I had an arrangement with the dean that I will teach about informal settlements, inner city crises, transport problems as viewed by the poor. So that teaching became a very rich experience for me, because I was given the freedom to do almost anything I wanted. And I tell you why I was given the freedom. It was a pretty lousy school of architecture where I was teaching. If it had been a good one, I would never have had the freedom. But that school of architecture today is one of the leading schools of architecture in Pakistan. But I'm talking of 1978, when it wasn't. So this is how I got involved. Ultimately, a very well-known Pakistani social scientist, Akhtar Hamid Khan, initiated the Urangi pilot project. Urangi is one of the towns of Karachi. Karachi has 18 towns. It has a population of well over 1 million people, and it is almost all informal settlements, almost all of it. And Akhtar Hamid Khan's project was finding an alternative to government policies and programs of upgrading informal settlements. The informal settlements program of the government of Pakistan, funded a large part of it by the bank and by the Asian Development Bank, did not work. It was far too expensive and far too top-down. It was regularizing and improving about 1 to 1.5% settlements a year, which meant that in 100 years we'd regularize the whole lot. Meanwhile, new ones would be created, and we would be in debt as well, heavily in debt. So the program was really about, can we deliver development through local resources? And that is, Akhtar Hamid Khan was very clear. He wanted a program that could, that the people could finance, manage, and build. And the questions that were put to me were, technically, can we have such a program? And so we questioned engineering standards, we questioned the processes through which development was delivered, and finally, we reduced costs considerably by questioning engineering standards and methodology, and the engineers were furious, they did not like it. But anyway, we went ahead with the program. I'll just summarize the program for you. The people identified 4 issues. Sanitation, number 1. Education, number 2. Health, number 3. Employment, number 4. And so we dealt with sanitation. I won't go into the details because there's no time, but we divided sanitation into 2. Internal sanitation and external sanitation. Internal sanitation consisted of the latrine in the house, the sewer in the lane, the collector sewer. And this was internal. External was trunk sewers and treatment plants. And we have been able to show that communities can build internal sanitation slowly, incrementally, over time, with their own resources, through their own management, provided they are given technical advice and managerial guidance. So today in Urangi, over 100,000 households, 106 to 98, I think is the right figure, have built their sanitation systems, their internal sanitation systems. And the government has supported them in building the external sanitations. The program has moved out of Urangi into 14 Pakistani towns and into, I don't remember the exact figure, but I think it's 136 other locations outside of Karachi. Where again, the same process has been followed. The replication of the project has been done by local governments, by communities, and finally, after all the conflicts and disagreements we had with the government, we came to a good understanding with them, and we were asked to frame the national sanitation policy of the government of Pakistan, which we did 2 years ago, and which was accepted by the cabinet last year. It's the policy. How it will be implemented is another issue. I won't talk about that. But the most important thing that has happened through the Urangi project is that communities from all over Pakistan have been able to organize, come together. And then we formed the Community Development Network, which brought all these communities together under one banner. It's a huge network. It meets every 3 months. Our big problem is that we don't have space for such a big network to meet. But we manage somehow or the other, and we meet in a different location every year. So this has become a fairly big voice. Now I come briefly to the other organization. Urangi was a community organization dealing with sanitation, health, education issues. But we understood that the problems of Urangi and the informal settlements were also the problems of the city. There was a direct link on how the city developed, managed land, implemented projects, nature of projects, and these settlements. You could not divorce the two. They were very closely related. So we created what we call the Urban Resource Center. And the Urban Resource Center is a research and advocacy center. And its purpose, really, is to make planning pro-poor and pro-environment. Now, the center was created about 8 or 9 years after Urangi was established. So we were able to bring in the Urangi communities and their linkages with other communities in Karachi as part of the center. So the center really became a get-together place for poor communities, academia, and we started to identify interest groups in the city. How we did it was, we kept news clippings. So in the newspapers it would be written, the Minibus Drivers Association is going on strike today. So we would contact the Minibus Drivers Association. Who are they? What are they? And we'd invite them over to our meetings. Or there would be the Scavengers Association has asked for a raise. So what is the Scavengers Association? So like this, over a period of 3 or 4 years, we built up a huge network which really dealt with the underbelly of the city. And Urangi communities were very important to it because they had connections with this underbelly in a big way. Then we started to look at government projects. The first project we looked at was the Karachi Mass Transit project, and we thought that it was disastrous. So we challenged it. And we challenged it by forming a citizens' forum on mass transit, in which there were economists, in which there were planners, and we presented the state with alternatives. State was very unhappy. They said we didn't want development. But we persisted, and the media became a great supporter of ours. And because the media became a supporter, the government slowly backed out, negotiations took place, the project was cancelled. Now, we did the same with a number of road projects. We did the same. We didn't always succeed. We failed also many times. We did the same with the solid waste management programs of the government. We did the same with the housing programs of the government. And we also challenged evictions which we did by bringing communities together, helping them to come together through information, through knowledge, through helping them document their situation, and then giving this material to them in a format that they could take to their political representatives, their members of parliament, their members of the provincial assemblies. And in the process, a sort of negotiation took place. Now, these two programs work very closely with each other. One has communities expanding, supporting each other, developing their health, education, and sanitation systems, making investments, accessing resources. And the other, a larger, looking at the larger issues. Now, the bringing together of all these separate interest groups is what is creating a very important space in the case of Karachi. And this is the space where interaction between all these different groups can take place. We ask, now that it's expanded, we have good relationships with the government, although they don't listen to us all the time. And we don't listen to them, but we talk, which we did not do before. I think it's a big change. So we talk, we discuss, we invite them over for explaining their policies, and when we invite them, then everybody comes, 400 or 500 people sometimes get together, and from different walks of life. But academia has played a very important role in this. And I think that role would not have been there if some of us who became involved in this process were not teachers. And it has changed the thinking of academia, because it is now the younger generation that we dealt with when they were students who are now the teachers. Of course, they have changed. They are much more ambitious than we were. Also, they love money more than we did. But all the same, the thinking is, I think, very much there. So I'd like to end over here. And for me, from what I have learnt, there is really a one-point agenda. And that is the creation of this space of interaction and the knowledge that is required for nurturing this space. These two things are very important. This is the one-point agenda, creating and nurturing the space. Ultimately, it will institutionalize itself, I think. Before I close, one or two other observations that I would like to make, both about the Urangi pilot project, the Urban Resource Center, and the other projects that I have worked with in Asia, successful ones, considered successful. That is one of culture. I think an important factor in these projects is that there is a culture of austerity. There's a culture of transparency. There's a culture of accountability. There is nothing that is hidden from the community. And there is nothing that can be done without the agreement of the community. That is just simply not possible. And that is, austerity makes this possible. If it was lavish, you could not do it. Second thing about the projects, I would like to say that they did not have any targets. They were open-ended. So that gave them considerable strength. They had periods of gestation, rather long periods of gestation, without which I do not think projects can consolidate, programs can develop without gestation. And this is exactly what is missing in formal sector projects. So with that, I will conclude. Thank you.
Thank you. Next, we'll hear from Christopher Williams, who is representative of UN Habitat in the Washington, D.C. office. Chris?
I too would like to thank both the Felser Institute as well as the Woodrow Wilson Center for Scholars for convening such an extraordinary two-day event. to bring together a small but extremely diverse group of people, folks from, as we heard, many different regions, and people approaching the issue of community resilience from very different angles, as practitioners, as activists, and as academics. I've been asked to talk about myself, UN Habitat, and community resilience in 10 minutes. This ought to be interesting. I'll try to keep it very brief. Like Arif and many of those in this panel, I had early influences that brought me into the issue of community resilience and dealing with social and economic justice issues very intensively. I was fortunate as an undergraduate to participate in an exchange program that brought me to East Africa at a fairly early age, and that put me in touch with a number of other people. And the next thing I knew, I was working in a war-torn section of Uganda during the rebel war with Museveni and then Okello, who was the head of the military, and before him Obote as the president. This sort of baptism by fire in terms of dealing with community and economic development issues led me to come back to the United States. And as my wife likes to say, I had to go all the way to Africa to figure out about community development in the United States. I ended up participating in a number of very interesting initiatives in the U.S., the most notable being the Dudley Street Neighborhood Initiative in the south side of Boston, working through an organization called Interchange, which was dedicated to trying to bring practitioners and activists from international settings, largely exiles living in the United States, along with community activists and educators in the U.S. And the lessons learned from that experience in many ways guided me much more than any of my formal academic training. As Arif said, you do the real learning often when you leave the campus rather than when you enter it. Although both are important, I think those initial confrontations with the human condition are often much more powerful in guiding you, particularly when you're in positions of authority and have to make difficult decisions. Shifting very briefly to UN Habitat. UN Habitat has changed a lot in its thinking over the last 25, 30 years as a UN agency toward the issue of community development more broadly, but as we've discussed for the last 2 days, community resilience and what resilience means by whom and for whom. UN Habitat is one of the few UN agencies that is actually based in the developing world. It's based in Nairobi, Kenya, along with UNEP, its sister agency. It's the only one of the major UN agencies, along with UNEP, outside of Africa, outside of North America and Europe. We have our world headquarters there and have operations in about 87 countries, looking broadly at the issue of affordable housing and sustainable urban development. How have we dealt with that issue, and from the perspective of community resilience? I think one way to, in a sense, develop a history or a narrative of this process, and there is those in the room who know much more about this than I, who have studied this process, and I would welcome their views on this in an exchange. One way to look at this narrative or history is to consider that the approach to community development has changed significantly as the loci of development or social exchange processes has shifted from the state, central government, out to local governments, community organizations, social movements, and the private sector. And this shift took place gradually in the 80s, but came to a fore in the 90s. And this affected the entire way that the United Nations system worked. Instead of sitting down with the Minister of Housing or Minister of Finance or Minister of Local Government, we had to work extensively with a wide cross-section of other people, institutions at the local level, urban poor organizations, community organizations, NGO networks, local governments, and various private utilities, banks, what have you. Now, we came slow to these, what I would call broadly non-state actors. I think the first non-state actor that we covered first, which is really a state actor, it just wasn't the central, was local government, city governments. And this led to a proliferation of programming through what we call global programs, the Community Development Program, the Urban Management Program, the Sustainable Cities Program, Local Agenda 21, among others. And these were initiatives that were designed essentially to pilot relationships and practices and partnerships in primarily urban settings that brought these different types of local actors together, but it was primarily focused around local government. And in a sense, it was a statement for a UN body to say, well, we have to get closer to the communities because we need to work more directly with local authorities who theoretically are closer to the communities and their organizations. We can't rely entirely on central government policy frameworks because they're often distant from the problem. I think that, in a sense, captured the thinking at that time. With the Habitat Agenda, which was formed in Istanbul in 1996, many people here participated in that global conference, there was a further shift that forced us to think not just at municipal level and central government level, but to really lock in with communities and their organizations. And this started, I think, fairly as my colleague Mohammed Halfani, who wished to be here today but was unable to come from Nairobi, and in many ways representing him, would call functionalist arguments. In other words, the approach to community development was that it had to fit into a larger strategy of local government and urban development. It was not seen as the concept of resilience and focusing on communities and their organizations was not necessarily as robust as it has been in subsequent years. However, it was important because it looked at the linkages between communities and local governments, between local governments and central governments, and how those three, in a sense, could be more effectively organized institutionally to grapple with enormous problems of basic service delivery and housing. In 2000, with the Millennium Declaration, things shifted quite a bit. Three things happened. One was we did a lot more work with advocacy groups. We actually took on advocacy ourselves, which is unprecedented for UN Habitat. Secondly, we did an enormous amount of work in post-conflict and post-disaster work from a people's perspective. And third, we worked with domestic banks and utility companies, private utility companies, in ways we never had before, not for corporate social responsibility, but to engage them in municipal development and work directly with communities and their organizations. So let me just unpack those three just briefly. In terms of advocacy, we developed what were known as global campaigns. We had a global campaign for secure tenure and a global campaign for urban governance. The global campaign for secure tenure was primarily focused on stopping violent forced evictions, illegal violent forced evictions, and providing governments with policy alternatives for resettlement and innovative consultation with community organizations. This put us in direct contact with a group that's represented here today by Rose, Slum and Shack Dwellers International. And someone could write a book about the relationship between UN Habitat and SDI and what it did to the UN. It essentially forced an entire rethink within the organization in terms of how it's focused on the question of what I would call agency. Who's participating in whose process? Is the UN participating in its own process and inviting communities and their organizations in? Or was the UN finding creative ways to support people's processes to further them? And, as a member state organization, speak with government from the perspective of communities representing their interests. This was a sea change in the way we worked. And you can imagine there was a lot of institutional resistance within the organization to this. Not everyone within the institution subscribed to this thinking. But the fact that the UN body could take on advocacy was an important step, in itself a form of advocacy. This led to creative work in post-conflict and post-disaster situations, primarily in very tough situations. Afghanistan, Pakistan, Somalia, tsunami-affected countries in Asia, including Indonesia. The Afghanistan work predated 2000. It's very interesting if you study the work of UN Habitat in Afghanistan under the Taliban. Extraordinary work. Women's organizations, very brave technical officers who worked with the women's groups under the Taliban and basically created the basis for which the Karzai government could roll out a national program on neighborhood resilience and neighborhood initiatives. This has been subsequently scaled up to an even higher level with USAID funding, support from a number of bilateral organizations. And as you can imagine, it's difficult when you get that much money to retain a community approach, and this becomes the challenge. How do you retain that community-based approach, maintain community resilience as you become more popular, as your initiative grows? In terms of private sector innovation, this would take two forms. Let me just focus on banks, domestic financial institutions, and the mobilization of domestic capital, and the question of private utilities, particularly water utilities. I think traditionally the approach of the UN and many NGOs and local governments to working with the private sector is, well, we need to somehow secure some philanthropy from them, or we have to tap that guilt that they have known as corporate social responsibility. I think the shift in our thinking was no. The private sector is a key player in cities and in communities. Half of the labor force of a lot of these private sector entities are people from these communities, often slums, informal settlements. We should approach these banks to try to change the kind of products that they develop. So rather than confine themselves to up-end, high-market loan products, how can we work with community development organizations, community development financial intermediaries, as is done in this country, to try to link banking and bank products to low-income populations for innovative approaches to affordable housing. And how do we tap community savings? And how do we tap limited amounts of public funds? And more importantly, how do we package the private capital with the community savings and the public sector groups, public sector investments, to put together a process where we can have some commercial transaction, but we also have a subsidy element. And there are people in this audience who've done a lot more work in this than I have and could speak more to that. In terms of water utility operators, an enormous amount of work working with water delivery companies as an era of privatization where the state has essentially undertaken these work through parastatals and moved those to private sector entities doesn't necessarily mean, and in some cases is just the opposite of extending services to the urban poor. So how do you, in a sense, create the space for networks of water utilities to begin to think much more seriously about interfacing with groups in informal settlements, such as the ones that Arif has talked about, so that you have innovative community contracting. You're extending private service delivery in creative ways to reach low-income populations. This is broad strokes, and I'm sorry to be so quick. Each of these issues is worth of a discussion in itself. Let me just conclude by saying that as part of this shift from state to non-state actors, we haven't left the state, in a sense. We are a UN body. Our governing body is 87 member states that look after what we do and approve our budget. But the shift is that if we approach the state through these non-state actors, we're having a very different conversation with our member states. The kind of policies that we're suggesting, the kind of institutional arrangements, the kind of advocacy that we're looking at is very different than if we were to strictly work with central governments. And so this shift, in a sense, has been what we've been after over time. For the next 5 years, we're interested in trying to elevate this discussion and more broadly the challenge of urbanization and slum formation within the context of climate change and the changing economic circumstances worldwide under what we refer to as the World Urban Forum. The World Urban Forum met in Nanjing, China in November of this year and will be in Rio de Janeiro probably October, November of 2010. What's great about the World Urban Forum is it's much larger than any of the institutions that participates in it, including UN Habitat and the member state that hosts it. In Nanjing, we had over 8,000 people. In Rio, we're expecting 10,000 people. And it creates, as Arif is saying, or as the Latin Americans say, espacio, the space in which very different groups of people can come together to discuss ideas and build a greater momentum on these challenging issues. Let me just say finally, I think in general, what's happening within a U.S. context, and let me just end on that, is an enormous potential. I think the next 2 years presents an extraordinary opportunity in the United States, given the kind of orientation that this government that's coming to power under the Obama administration has to urban issues. And I would appeal to everyone here to take that very seriously. We not only have a president who's a former community organizer, but we have a president that's establishing a White House Office of Urban Policy. This has never existed in the history of the United States. So it's not necessarily an ideological orientation whether you like this or not, but their ethos, their focus coming out largely of Chicago and urban settings presents an enormous opportunity to elevate the issue of urban questions both at home and abroad. And I think what's needed in the coming months is to make sure that there is more emphasis on helping that administration and members of Congress and policy institutes think creatively about a framework for dealing with the challenges of community resilience, and helping communities become more resilient within, in at least our case, the context of sustainable urbanization. I leave you with 4 points of that framework. Land tenure, security of land tenure. Basic water sanitation provision, as we heard from Arif. Innovations in finance, how to bring very interesting parts of the private sector together to allow sustainable financing to take place, not relying entirely on public funds. And lastly, very creative and innovative and inclusive urban planning, management, and governance. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Chris. Next, we're going to hear from Pablo Lopez, who is Executive Director of Emerging Communities, and Nathan of the Red Wolf Band in Albuquerque, New Mexico. Pablo?
Good evening, or good afternoon. Hearty handshake to each and every one of you. Thanks for coming. I guess I'm supposed to say a little bit about myself. My name is Pablo Lopez. I'm from the territories of New Mexico. That's where all my people come from. I also have an Indian name, and I'm sure all of you have said it at one time, Holy Cow. So I was the last of my particular family, the 6 members of my family, to be born through a medicine woman. And after I was born, she came into the room and told my mother, I did everything I could, but he lived anyways. So these are all part of the indigenous cosmology because it just proved I was strong enough to live. And as a human being, I'm trying to be strong enough to lead my own community. In comparison to all my relatives who are sitting up here, I deal only with nano and micro community. So the Chunkamani Totankaluta came about. It's the Red Wolf Band of indigenous people of Albuquerque. I deal with and make relations with only urban Indians and not go into reservations, even though my uncles and relatives live on reservations. I'm trying to have ceremony that brings together and creates a centrifugal force for indigenous people to come to ceremony inside the urban situation. So we operate, this came about through what we call vision at ceremonies. We do various ceremonies. In Ikaga, they call it, in English, they call it sweat lodge. We do the Sundance ceremony, Iwangwa Chipilo, pipe ceremonies, healing ceremonies, marriage ceremonies. I even conducted a couple of marriages myself, and that's what's very good for me is that they're all still together. I don't know if they're happy, but they're all still together. So the idea of this vision was to create traditional society within this nano and micro community. And traditional society had leaders, speakers, medicine people, bundle carriers, staff carriers, and people who represented the ideas of indigenous society. So we came up with these ideas and principles to guide ourselves because we didn't have anything else that operated within the urban context. So we called it how much is enough economic principle. That means that we have a certain amount of money, but we know how many bills we have. We have fixed costs, we have mortgages, we have rental, we have car bills, we have food bills, we have children bills. But once we reach that level, then we take the rest of the money and we share it with the community. And this creates a micro bank. And then we have bottom-out philosophy. We don't go bottom-up, top-down. Bottom-out is just to recycle money within our own communities. We have wealth creation. We created the ECA, which is El Caballero Aguilar Recording Studio. We created a micro and family garden project. So we have gardens growing in various families' yards, and we recycle and distribute food to other community members and outside people also. We have a business plan now for teepee business on the reservation, which my uncle will conduct. We also deal with flea market economy. Flea market economy only deals with micro amounts of money. We don't have millions of dollars. We're not asking for any money. Although, you know, since everybody's asking for a bailout, I think I'm going to ask for a bailout for the Red Wolf. And the last thing we created was this 8 components of survivability to sustainability. We know that people in the city who don't have a lot of money are surviving, and that's an ability. And I think we have to learn why and how they're surviving, and then be able to teach that to other people so they can survive also, so that we don't have homelessness and hunger and all these other things. We're going to have to be able to teach other people how to survive. But we have to lead ourselves to sustainability, and that'd be our ability to feed ourselves, to know what good health is. On the issue of health, right? We have medicine people. We have Chinese medicine doctor within our society. But eventually, some of us are going to need surgery. So that's the most complex part of health. But we don't have any surgeons in our little tribal group. But we know that we need health, and we have to be proactive in our own health and taking care of ourselves. So like I said, I'm just dealing on a real micro community level. But I think there's a lot of communities out there, a lot of people who are just like us, who are just barely making it, and they need to learn these principles to be able to do the same thing. When you think about it, I would say that 50% of all the families in the United States live from check to check. And if you look at people of color, that percentage probably goes up higher. So we're willing to, be an example for other communities to say, this is the way you're going to do it. And one of the relatives' stories, he says, we are on our own. And we've known that for 500 years. And we're going to continue to do that because we need to do this. Thank you.
Our next speaker is Rose Molokoane. She is a board member of Shack Slum Dwellers International and national chairperson of the Federation of the Urban and Rural Poor, otherwise known as Fed Up.
Thank you very much, Blair. I have to say something about myself, but I don't know what to say about myself, because maybe I'm just another rose amongst the thorns, as my name explains. I'm born in a family of 12 children. We were only 2 girls with 10 boys, so I have to struggle to survive. And today, I'm requested to sit here in front of you, one lady amongst, how many men? 6. So I really feel offended. And I don't know whether it's because I'm born from that kind of society that every time when I go, I'm be put amongst the thorns. So maybe I have to change my name and call myself in another name. And secondly, I don't know how to explain myself because I heard Arif saying I'm an architect. Everybody was talking about the high-leveled positions. But for me, I'm coming from a very small community called Ougasi, and in English it's called Old Location, that was facing eviction in 1985. And because of the community organization, we fought the eviction. And it means I was born and bred, and I'm still staying there. Through the strength of the organization that I belong to, I managed to build an 8-roomed house. And I'm proud to stay in that kind of community because it has taught me a lot. In South Africa, when you go to school, before you go to tertiary, you have to go from substandard A up until standard 10. But because my mother died when I was 10 years, and I was left with now 11 men, including my father, I have to survive my education until standard 10. So I couldn't go to tertiary. So it means I don't have any degree, any PhD. I can't tell you that I'm an architect or whatever. So I'm just a nobody, trying to find somebody to share something in order to get out with something. So I was fortunate to be invited in a conference in 1991 where some poor people were brought together by the Catholic Bishops' Conference to say, poor people, come up with an agenda that belongs to you. Unfortunately, I didn't even know what is the meaning of agenda at that time. So the area where we had the meeting was just like this. We were sitting like how you are sitting here, and people would come and give speeches. I was sitting right at the back. I couldn't speak because I don't know what I'm going to speak about. But at the end of the day, because different countries were invited, I was interested to listen to the story from India. where the guy from India, who is now the president of Sheikh Dwellers International, was giving a story of saying, in India, we voted for our government for 40 years, and then we expected honey and milk to flow on the street. But at the end of the day, after 40 years, we got a queue of 800 people sharing one toilet. I said, what? With me in my community, I'm shitting in a bucket system. So my family is sharing one toilet, 12 people sharing one bucket for the whole week. Once a time, the municipality will come and take the bucket away. I grew in that kind of a situation. But I became interested to see the West in India, a queue. So whilst we were having lunch, I joked with joking and saying, I really want to come to India. I want to see this queue. I want to join the queue. And fortunately, the guys who were requested to arrange this conference, this guy is called Joel Bolnick. He's still there. He's my colleague. He listened to my discussion with joking. Then he got interested to say, it means there are some people who are interested in learning amongst each other. So he went back to the church and said, can we arrange an exchange program to India? The South Africans are interested to learn. So we went to India in May 1992. I spent 20 days in India just to learn how the Indians have succeeded the problems from their government. First thing that I expected was the queue. But now I got the answer on my own, because instead of seeing the queue of people, I'm sorry to say that I saw the queue of shit lying on the pavement in the city center. And secondly, I saw poor women sleeping on the pavement with a sari on top of themselves. Worst part, I experienced a very bad situation where one of the women was giving birth on the street. Then I said, this is the worst situation. I thought I'm poor in South Africa, but no, these people are very poor. But the only thing that I gathered and took back to South Africa was the love that these people had amongst each other. They organized themselves as women. Because why? They are well-organized men. That is why I'm so proud to stand in front of these men, because I'm a well-organized man. I know what I want. The word woman means well-organized men. And I get so encouraged when I do what I do, because I understand that I'm well-organized. So these well-organized men of India used savings as a tool to mobilize themselves. What kind of savings? People think that rich people are the one who has to save. But these poor people saved 1 rupee, 2 rupees, 3 rupees a day. Then I said, but they said, we want to have land, we want to have employment, we want to have houses. I said, with 1 rupee, 2 rupee, 3 rupees, no, you can't. They said, no, you will see one day. But I learned that by saving, they were not saving money, they were saving people. They were saving ideas on how to address their situation. That's what I copied from them and took it back to South Africa. I remember in my community, I went to the chairperson of the civic organization and requested him to call a big meeting so that I can give a report back from India. 500 people came to the meeting. I was excited, hoping that everyone will get excited. Yes, we start savings. I preached and preached and preached. After the meeting, only 11 old mamas remained in the hall. And they said, Rose, we want to understand more about these savings. I was so disappointed. Out of 500 people, only 11. Imagine, only 11 women, not a single man. They said, no, we want to save 50 rands a month. I said, no, but the Indian ladies are saving 1 rupee. You don't have money. Now we will. We want to build houses very quickly. At the end of the month, only 1 pensioner came with 150 rand. They couldn't afford to save. So during the sharing of information, they started to understand that the little money that we save together can build bigger. So from 1992 until 1994, we started to organize women around the communities. But we didn't say we are closing doors for men. We said we are organizing communities using savings as a tool to leverage more resources. But because men are so inferior, most of them didn't want to join. They said, no, this is the woman thing. But at the end of the day, the benefit belongs to the entire family, not to the individual who joined the saving scheme. So I'm trying to raise these ideas that sometimes people take little things. I'm sorry to say men take little things for granted. Saving R1, it's just child's play. I have to have 50 rand in my pocket so that I should buy a cigarette, I should buy a newspaper, I should buy beer. But with a woman, if she has 50 rand, she has to buy groceries, she has to buy a shirt for the husband, she has to pay electricity, she has to pay grocery, she has to steal some money for her own parents. So you can see that women are the most important financial managers in the whole globe, I'm sure. I don't know. But the federation motivated me so much that we started to have exchange programs through this organization in South Africa called People's Dialogue. We didn't want to end up between South Africa and India only. We expanded to Africa. Up until today, we have organized over 38 countries around the world, in Asia, Latin America, and Africa. And then we are having different components or different rituals that we use to strengthen or to form ourselves as a resilient, It's resilience or resilience community. This is the new word that I got since I got here, and I will take it back with me. We are focusing on savings, using women as the tool to organize and mobilize the communities. We use exchange programs to learn from one another's experience. Like, for instance, today I'm here with Sonia from the Philippines. I went to Philippines to learn more on how to allocate loans to each other, on how to have compulsory savings, voluntary savings, savings for health. I've copied that back to South Africa. And then we are using information gathering in the form of enumeration and survey. We have realized that the formal world always say, we want to do this for the poor. The poor don't have land. Or maybe the people from the informal settlement, they don't have houses. They are not working. They are not educated. We have to do this for them. But with the language of Shack Dwellers International, we say, we are really sick and tired of becoming the subject or the object of the formal world. We want to stand up, organize ourselves, collect information that will strengthen our goal that we want to achieve, and then we use it to leverage or to open doors to negotiate with the formal world. I remember we attended one of the World Urban Forum where they were talking about the Millennium Declaration goals. And then we asked a question, who are the goalkeepers? Then we showed them that we are the goalkeepers because we are the one that blocks the policy if it is not implemented properly. We are the one that has to accept the policy if needs to be implemented. So we are using information gathering to try to understand the policies and to influence those policies. We are also looking at the issues of land and housing. Poor people are not deliberately staying in informal settlements or in slum areas. They are pushed by circumstances to end up staying in those areas. But because we said we are organizing ourselves, we want to make all these pieces of land that we have occupied to be legitimate. And then we can't do it if we don't have anything to show. So when we talk of land, We fight for security of tenure. As Chris have already said, we have influenced the UN to say, come to us, we also need security of tenure. And I remember when they came to South Africa, we launched the security of tenure. We went to Namibia, we did that. We went to India, we also did that. Even in the Philippines, we did launch the security of tenure together with the United Nations. So we are fighting for land for the landless. And then when it comes for housing, we know what kind of a house we want as the poor people. No one should tell me that I have to stay in a one-roomed house like what is happening in South Africa. The government say, okay, we are feeling pity for you. That is why we want to give you subsidies. We want to build you houses because you are poor. Yes, I can be poor and landless and homeless, but I'm not hopeless. I know what I know I want with my life. From a family of 12, sharing one room, does it make sense? My father and my mother built a 5-roomed shack, and today the government want to build me a brick shack of 1 room. That doesn't make sense. In the Federation, we say, we know what kind of a house we want. We know how to cost the house that we want to build. We know how to build the house that we are going to use. As a woman, I know where the kitchen should be. I know where the dining room should be. I know where my bedroom should be and my children's bedroom should be. So I am the one who plan my own destiny. And I only need somebody to come and support what I do. We are not saying we are undermining professionals, academics and architects and lecturers and la. No, we respect what you do. But we say, take what you have, come and translate what I do into a formal language. Because my language is so informal that sometimes you will never understand. If I draw my house, I just put it like this and this, but you come with a ruler and a pencil and a what. So if I have done it with my own hand, use your ruler to make it formal. So we say, let's join hands together and walk the same path for us to have a better development for the poor in the whole world. And then I say, again in the Federation, we are using the strategy of lobbying and advocating. That's why we are forging ourselves to sit in the multilaterals and what? Bilaterals and multilaterals. Yeah, this is the way that when I work with Chris or go with Chris around, I learn a lot. He's a multilateral from UN. We always tell them that we want to be part of you. We want to be your partner. We don't want to be beneficiaries or end users. We want to be partners with the formal world. That is why, and it's not just the talking. We talk and walk the talk and do the talk. That is why today, SDI is represented in the Cities Alliance. We are also part of the decision-making of Cities Alliance. We also sit in the board of directors of slum upgrading facility that is being established by the UN where Chris belongs. And I'm gossiping, he should not listen. They stole the idea from us. But we just said to them, we will follow you, no problem, as long as you have learned from us. And then with there's this committee called ACFI within the United Nations, Advisory Group on Forced Evictions. I remember it was a general council in the UN in Nairobi where we stood up when the UN and all the governments that were there, they were talking about cities without slums. Then we said, what is the meaning of cities without slums? We have to create beautiful cities. So it means creating beautiful cities is to get rid of the slums. So what we said to them was that, yes, you can get rid of the slums, but not of the slum dwellers. So it means sit down with the slum dwellers, come up with a plan on saying, how are we going to do to change the city to be the better city for all? So we influenced the UN to establish ACFI, whereby Sheikh Dwellers International is part of ACFI. We are continuing to influence them. And then we said we also participate at the United Nations General Council. It means we are becoming a small government on our own, because the General Council is consisting of big guns from different governments, and now we have formed ourselves into an informal government. So we are also sitting in that. And then we are, because we realize that an Englishman always say money speaks. Although we say we are saving little, but we want to grow big. We said, if I say in South Africa I've got 285 million from my Minister of Housing, and Sonia say I've got 500 pesos from my Minister of Land, it doesn't give an impact. So we agreed that as poor people, to raise our voice very strong, we should establish what we call Urban Poor Fund International, whereby this fund is used as a leverage to attract more funding from funding agencies. Because most of the time the agencies will say, we are no more supporting South Africa because South Africa is rich. But if they support Urban Poor Fund International, South Africa will benefit through this fund. So that is why we agreed to form that, and we lobbied some members of different governments. Like my Minister of Housing agreed to chair the Board of Governors of our Urban Poor Fund International. And we've got an icon called Desmond Tutu from South Africa. He's an icon for that fund. We've got the minister from Norway. We've got the minister from Sri Lanka. We are having a minister from Sweden who agreed to support. So it is not just to go and propose love from these people, to say, we love you, can you come with us? We make challenging statements that, are you ready to support us? What do you bring? Then my minister said, 285 million for the federation in South Africa. The Norway minister said, 2 million euros to the fund. And then the Bill Gates, they are here in America, the biggest funding agency. You know, what I like with some of the people, they don't feel pity, but they feel excited that they even forget that they should follow the rules. The Bill Gates, the lady called Melanie, yes, she closed her eyes and said, I'm pledging $10 million. But we didn't have any account where to put the $10 million. He said, I'm taking a risk because you talk so sweet. So he bought our token by giving us 10 million. So the $10 million that came from the Bill Gates became the seeding fund to start our Urban Poor Fund International. So this shows that if we are well organized and talk with one voice, aiming at reaching the same goal, whether you can be from south, east, west, north, but your voice will be heard. So today I would like to say, finally, I was preaching a lot, and I can see that Mr. Blair wants to stop me. We will continue to organize poor people around the world. We will continue to make sure that the poor people's voice is heard. We will forge to bridge this gap that is between the informal and the formal world. Because if we don't forge it on our own, no one will do it for us. So for a community to be strong is to do something on the ground and call the government and say, come and see what I do. And by so doing, it gives power to influence the policies. Because for the last 2 days, I said, Blair, policies are like beautiful ladies, beautiful ladies who don't have any boyfriend to propose love. Thank you very much.
Thank you. And our final presenter will be Davinder Lamba, Executive Director, Mazingira Institute in Nairobi.
Hello, everyone. Are you all awake? I think after listening to Rose, you must be very awake. So thank you for doing me a favor by activating everybody. Okay, bit of biography. I'm Kenyan, that's my home. And the story is that when the Lunatic Express began in the 1890s, there was a migration from India, which was then India and Pakistan together. And that's when my ancestors came to Kenya. So I am, in a way, a product of the globalization phase, but the imperial phase of globalization. So that's enough. The rest is all history. So I'm Kenyan without a prefix. I'm not Asian Kenyan and not African American. I do not use a prefix. I just am Kenyan. So that's as simple as that. My storyline is going to be about societies in transition from authoritarianism to democracy, because that is what the Kenyan society is going through. And in this story, I'm going to try and therefore talk about resilience. I will actually talk about vulnerability and resilience because to me that is the continuum. So, and I'll try and therefore end up by demonstrating to you that Kenya is not only a weak state, which you understand, those of you who study political science, but weak states or weakening states. It was a weak and a weakening state under neoliberal globalization, which we all understand, but it is also a weak nation. It's a weak state and a weak nation. And the reason it is a weak nation, because it has strong ethnic, territorial, linguistic communities. It has a paradox. Okay? So now, first a little bit of theoretical stuff, because we have people in the audience who want to really know, are we going to talk about resiliency in an opaque way? I'm going to make the concept a little bit translucent. And I think it is our role for the last 2 days we've been meeting to actually make the concept less opaque if we can. What you'll find is that if you look at the language, as I do, because I do look at things from a semiotic perspective, if you look at the language of resilience, you will find the language is something like this, a kind of adaptation of an entity, in this case a social entity or a system, to turbulence by absorbing the shocks, by learning from it, by self-organizing, by recovery, and by continuing to develop. Now, if you look at the language of vulnerability, then it's kind of propensity of a system to suffer harm from a turbulence. And if you look at the language of sustainability, it is something like a kind of long-term self-maintenance of a social entity or a system by itself. We're talking about social sustainability. Now, if you triangulate all those three, you'll begin to see that the language is interesting. And how do you distinguish one concept from the others? Now, whereas resiliency is not a prescriptive concept yet, because sustainability is, because we have sustainable development. It's an international norm. It's a decision. It's an imperative. So it's very important. But they do not actually express any language of power. For instance, there's no language of voice, of decision, of participation, and so on. Okay? I'm not saying it's a bad thing. Just that's speaking theoretically a bit. Now, those of you who know that the one major historical disturbance was the scramble for Africa. And this scramble created African states before they became nations, historically. And it's very important that in talking about these things, we do not become ahistorical. So that was the first major disturbance. And the way that disturbance was absorbed, you got states, but we didn't become nations. Now, from 63, when we became independent, up until 2002, Kenya had authoritarian rule. In 2002, we managed to oust the second authoritarian regime. And in 2003, we thought we had achieved democracy. In the early 90s, I was part of a movement that demanded a new constitutional order for Kenya, a complete new constitutional order to address two things: to create a strong state and to create a strong nation. Whilst it is not so difficult to create constitutionally a strong state, because we understand different types of political systems, electoral systems, different types of governance systems, it is extremely difficult to create a strong nation out of ethnic territorial communities. And all hell broke loose when we had our general elections in December of last year. The presidential elections were disputed, and the country saw unprecedented violence. Lasted from 28th of December to 28th of February, with 350,000 internally displaced people, over 1,200 lost lives, extensive amount of rape of women, deployment of militias, and it took the international community, the civil society, and the African Union to cause enough pressure on the two rival parties to create a national accord. And in this national accord, there were several outcomes. Some were forced by the civil society. One of the outcomes was to have a commission of inquiry to look into post-electoral violence. That commission of inquiry has finished its work, and its recommendation is to set up a Kenyan tribunal, a court, to investigate persons associated with the violence. And the deadline for setting up that court to create a statute is 17th of December. Should the system fail to comply with that requirement, the matter will proceed to the International Criminal Court, and the chief prosecutor would engage into investigations. Now, because the disputed presidential elections mean the two rival parties are also made up of these ethnic territorial units, they're not political parties, they're aggregates of them, this outcome in itself becoming a new form of turbulence. Because different communities are saying is that our community is going to be penalized. My community is going to be penalized. We are going to be in trouble. Other communities are after our politicians. So this is what I mean by a weak nation. Over this period, we've also had, from 63 up until February this year, gross violations of human rights under the authoritarian regimes. We had massacres, we had torture, we had exiles, we had extrajudicial killings, disappearances of people, plunder of land and wealth. So in 2003, with the new regime, I was part of a task force to establish Truth, Justice, and a Reconciliation Commission in Kenya. And we talked to people, to the victims throughout the country. And they said, we know the truth, we can reconcile, but we want justice. Now this is the question that is facing Kenya at the moment on the vulnerability to resiliency continuum. We are vulnerable. When you engage in transitional justice, that is the mechanism of transformation in times of transition with countries with a dark history and wanting to go towards a brighter and robust future. Resiliency is the outcome you want. Okay? it is the outcome. Now, if you cannot achieve resiliency as the outcome, as you engage in the process of transitional justice, you are also very vulnerable to further turbulence. To undertake this kind of a venture has many, many risks. So, in the absence of not being yet a nation, unlike the European experience where the nations came before the state, we have a double challenge of building a strong state with a new constitution coming up next year, and trying to achieve a resilient nation. So how do we prepare ourselves in our truth, justice, and reconciliation quest? And in seeking the justice for the crimes committed in the post-electoral violence phase are the two big challenges facing that country and a nation. Therefore, in order to achieve resilience as an outcome, it is going to take a tremendous amount of effort for the Kenyans to find the glue, the cohesion, to stay together, suffer the pain, seek the reconciliation and the reparations that are necessary. Thank you.
Thank you. Well, we've had quite a remarkable series of presentations, and let me see if there are immediate questions or comments from the floor. We can go to the floor. Okay, let me make one observation and maybe see if it can prompt a response. Living in Washington at this moment, we've been hearing a lot of talk about huge amounts of money being given to, quote unquote, bail out this sector of the economy or that sector of the economy, this bank, that bank. And what struck me about all of your presentations from the very beginning, Arif spoke of austerity. Rose talked about really saving 50 rand or 1 rupee and building it up. I think each and every one of you really talked about how there can be too much money, or that money isn't what is at stake when one talks about community resilience. I'm wondering if anybody would like to maybe amplify their thoughts about how people who are with funding organizations should think about the importance of money, because presumably you're not saying money is unimportant, but you're really talking about how money is used and not used and misused. And what lessons are there for money to become a tool of community resilience rather than getting in the way? Arif, do you want to? I think you've thought about this question.
Well, I can try and answer the question. I think austerity is extremely important. I mean, if you look at funding, what is known as funding projects, funding programs, and we worked with funders. We've had joint programs. The thing that alienates communities from these programs is their lavishness. Posh vehicles, air-conditioned offices, large sums of money spent on seminars at all the wrong places, which the communities can't come to or are not comfortable with. Monitoring, which is really policing, again, huge sums of money spent on that, and accounts that are not available for inspection or viewing. And this is not a partnership. it is not something that produces quote-unquote sustainability. Sustainability itself is a suspect term. But anyway, so I think that aspect is there. The moment you have programs of this nature, the community's first reaction is they have lots of money which they are getting through associating with us, and that completely changes the nature of the program. See? So this, I think this is very much so, and we realized this very early, and consequently we have kept ourselves away from big funding. Now just can I take another minute? In the case of the Urban Resource Center, my God, we've been wooed. We've been offered big money on all sorts of terms, both by the government of Pakistan, local government, academic institutions, foreign funders. We have not taken it. The moment we take this money and we do what they want us to do, three things happen. Number one, we will have to hire posh planners and architects. That will completely change the nature of this institution that is rooted in the community. It will all be about figures, facts, details that don't really matter to the sort of work we are doing. That is one thing that will happen. So that, and it's very serious, you know, the nature of the place will change. Number two, we will have to run after that money every year or every 3 years. No surety that we are going to get it again. It's out. So that's the second problem. Third problem is that you cannot take the stands that you would normally take based on principles of equity and justice, because you are committed to something for whom equity and justice does not really matter. What does matter is that money is spent in a particular period of time and certain program targets are achieved that can form a report. I'm sorry if I'm being harsh, but this is, we thought about this a lot since we had all the pressure for receiving these funds. There are lots of other issues also that are linked to funding. Foreign consultants are linked to funding. Foreign monitors are linked to funding. International tendering is linked to funding. And if you add it all up, then something that costs 1 rupee in terms of labor and materials adds up to about 25, 30 rupees. I can prove it to you through a whole list of projects which we analyzed. So money has its problems. And what I have learnt in these 35 years of being associated, almost 40 now, with this sort of development, is that ultimately it is institutions that matter. Viable, strong institutions rooted in the sociology of the country. How you achieve them, that's another discussion. They matter. And second, the immense social change that has taken place in our societies, which is huge and which goes unnoticed, which is not a part of any development paradigm, that needs new societal values. It needs a new culture. And academia, as it is structured, and the media as it operates today, does not provide that, does not provide the basis of it, of those new societal values. I think these are serious issues. And projects and programs like the one we run, if they can expand, they can be replicated. There are lots of other programs in my country and in Asia, in the cities I know. There are lots of programs. How do you mainstream them so that this can happen. I think that is the main issue.
Any other observations? Rose?
I remember one year we came here in America as SDI. We wanted to have a meeting with the World Bank and the Cities Alliance with the aim of saying, okay, we had that Cities Alliance is supporting with funding. Yeah. And the World Bank is also supporting with funding. So we said, let's also go there because, yes, we can't drive a car without petrol, and you have to pay petrol instead of before you drive the car. So when we went to the Cities Alliance, as Arif is saying, beautiful office, everything very beautiful, and we were excited to say, at least we are now in America, and we heard that America is the richest country in the whole world, so we are going to get money. Unfortunately, Cities Alliance told us that. Unfortunately, we can't give you the money because we have to give communities money via the municipalities. But we are an organized community. We have started an initiative on the ground. Is it wrong that you can take at least a fraction of your budget and say, let's prove to these municipalities that communities can also do things? The same applied to the World Bank. Then we just said, to hell, we won't go to them anymore. Until such time, Cities Alliance came begging us to say, come and sit in our board of directors so that we can influence change in how we are offering money. What I'm trying to say is that not that our organizations don't want to have money, but before you give us money, create the partnership that will come up with the system that will satisfy both parties. For instance, we are saying, who is dancing to whose tune? It is my development. It is your money. Even if I don't have money, I can maybe manage to do something with my development. You can bring a lot of money, but at the end of the day, if it's got strings attached, as what Arif is saying, 2006, my Minister of Housing in South Africa, amongst almost 300 delegates from outside the country, pledged an amount of 285 million, equals to 9,000 subsidies to my organization on the 13th of May 2006. And if I'm not wrong, it was before lunch. The Federation, we've got the money, we've got the money. 2006, 7, we are in 2008. We only have built 56 houses. Not that we can't build houses, because the money is there in paper, but it's not there in the bank. You go to the national, they say, okay, it is the minister, go to the province. The province, no, we don't have that budget. So, you see, that's why we are fighting to have partnership with all these governments and all these funding agencies, so that when they give money, they should not give money according to how they want. They should give money according to how we want to use it. Because we know that before we come to you, we are already prepared. Our systems are on the table. Our development is prepared. We only want to implement. So we've got a real serious problem. As Arif is saying, 10 million is pledged, but only 1 million will go on the ground. The whole 9 million, even if when they were having an office in a small city, they will move to the bigger city so that they can get a posh office. Director, they will hire a director, a deputy director, deputy director, accountant, chartered accountant, administrator, bookkeeper, all these words. They will hire all those people in the office. And then when you go to the office, you'll find that they are playing behind their laptops. When you want to check what are they doing, they are playing cards and games. Nothing is done. At the end of the day, they need a report. They will come to the community and say, what do you call it? Participatory budgeting, yeah. Call a very big mass meeting. We want to build 1,000 houses. We want to build a sewer line. We want to put electricity. Yes, yes. We don't understand. We just agree. Then they will write a big Bible of a report to the funder. And the funder says, oh, there's good things happening. Then they will pump more money. But when they come to monitor, there's nothing on the ground. So we are saying it's not that we don't want money. We want money because we want to scale up our development. But it should be on our own tune. Then it will be good.
Again, let me see if there are questions. This gentleman right here, we'll get you a microphone. And we're getting a microphone now. Please identify yourself.
I'm Chongiri from the Millennium Project, and I'm working on the future of the cities and the more socially integrated urban redevelopment, something like that. And I was really appreciate for your great words. It impressed me a lot. And I got three questions two questions for three people. First question is to Arif and Lopez, and I really want to do some more research on your project that you conducted before. So I want to know whether you had a publicated some publication or website or something like that. That is a really easy question. And the other question is to Mr. Pablo. In this year, UNFPA says in their annual reports, half of the world population have moved to the urban area, and the acceleration of urbanization will be accelerated, and the more the acceleration of the climate change is also accelerated. With that kind of with this context, I think that your micro nano unit community program is really interesting, but I'm just a little bit worried, not worried, wondering about you have enough compatibility in a close future as a smaller capacity to manage community itself or your cities. So I just want to hear about your opinion on it.
Actually, would you like to go first since Rose and Arif just spoke?
Okay. What we see is a very organic way of doing things. It's a direct response to situations that happen within the city. We see direct responses from the poor communities to unemployment, to situations that have already been committed, and they just naturally take place. Right? It's an adaptability that isn't described in books, but it's described in action of people. When people nowadays lose their jobs, right away they're forming committees among themselves to be able to sustain themselves to certain periods through extended family. We call it extended family, but we're seeing that all through the city of Albuquerque, where I'm living right now. I haven't done extensive studies in other cities, but I'm sure that, because people are actually surviving in the cities the way they are today, then that's happening. I was just talking about this bailout, right? Since I live in my community and I'm trying to understand how my community works, when this system failed, because I didn't have stocks and bonds and retirements and all this other stuff, it didn't affect me. And it didn't affect the other hundreds of thousands of people who are living at my level in my city. And it's not affecting anybody else in other cities. So we're adapting, continually adapting at a real organic level to the situations that are at hand. That people are going hungry, going without health care, prenatal care and all these things. It's a travesty in our society because we should be at least more advanced. At least what I'm hearing from Fetcher is love and justice and all these things are vital things for people to incorporate for themselves. The question that Blair had asked, money should be a fertilizer so we can grow trees. And the trees and the fruits of these trees should be love and justice and humanity. So those are the kind of things that I think if society is going to advance and evolve into something that it should be, then we have to take all these things and make sure that that happens. But for me, it's happening at a very organic level and it's taking place, regardless of how things are being portrayed in other ways.
Okay. Rose and then Arif.
Okay. My nephews always call me a BBT, born before technology. So unfortunately, I tried to connect myself to an email. I tried to run from pillar to post with this network, cell phone networks, but unfortunately I couldn't get through, but I'm still trying. But if I have to get my email, I use our office in Cape Town, and I'm staying in Pretoria. The email is sdi@courc.co.za, and the website is www.sdinet.org, 0RG. So that's how I get my mails or my contacts. If you want to get hold of me, you use this email, then they will pass the message to me, because I have to transform myself to become BTA, born after technology.
There are 3 websites you might like to visit. One is called OPP Institutions. OPP Institutions, that's one word. The other is URC Karachi, also one word. The third is ACHR. All 3 of them have considerable information, and there are a large number of books on the work, number of monographs, regular reports. You can access them all.
Okay. Next question or comment in the last row.
Hi, I'm Sarah Bobek from the Maxwell School at Syracuse University, and I just wanted to thank you guys for coming today and speaking. It was really great. And I just had a question about what Rose said, actually, about the attitude that women have taken in her community and how they seem to be a little more patient and have like a more long-term view. And I was wondering if there are similar attitudes throughout the rest of the communities, and if so, how has that been, I guess, how has that been kind of harnessed? As like to get a more long-term view going for different community projects.
Okay.
Thanks.
I don't know whether I heard you properly, but I will answer what I heard. I think in my community, like when we organize, we always refer ourselves to the Bible, where in the Bible there are some people who are like Thomas, who believe in seeing things happening. And then sometimes it is said everyone can say Lord, Lord, but not all of them will get into heaven. And that's exactly what is happening. Everyone will agree that yes, this process is fantastic, it's very good. We appreciate it. We'll come to the meeting. And then you become happy. When you come to the meeting, out of 50, you get 20 people coming. It is still continuing to happen. But when you build one house, then 5 people will come and say, we really want to join the organization. So the strategy that we are using is to create friends with the councillors, the ward committees, the mayors, and we always go to the council offices, even if we don't do anything, so that they should see that we are still in existence, so that if there's a project that we are bringing in the community, we get a political buy-in from the councillors to help us motivate our project to the community. but not the entire, because a lot of people are too dependent. And then unfortunately our government has created the situation of entitlement to the people in the communities, whereby they are so lazy to do anything for themselves. They are waiting for government to do everything. But as I said, our organization is not focusing on dealing with a specific project. We are a process that is continuing to come up with different issues. If we see that health issue has failed today, we come up with another issue, education, then we address the issue of education, housing, land. So we are having a package of issues that we use as a tool to mobilize the communities. Sometimes there is resistance, sometimes people, yes, they follow and agree to support the process.
I'm going to go back to the audience in a moment, but Chris, I know you're probably going to have to leave shortly, and I'm wondering if you could, respond, isn't quite the right word, comment on what the difference has been in UN Habitat, you think, and maybe more generally, by the creation and presence of organizations such as the ones that Rose represents. How much of a difference has it made in sitting where you sit, that there are organizations out there, people out there like her?
Well, I'd like to emphasize.
Sure.
I'd like to emphasize that there are many organizations. I think I highlighted Rose because she was here. I'm picking on Rose because she was here. Just like she was picking on me. We do this dance often when we're in these types of forums. I think, equally important is the influence of people like Davinder. He has been a force to reckon with, not him as an individual, but the kinds of social mobilization and human rights activism that's taken place. And I think both of these are representative of other individuals and movements in most of the countries in which we're working. And I think what's happened over time within the UN, at least from where I sit, is that we have come to the realization that there is need for us to take advantage of the fact that we're a member state organization and take advantage that we have a direct line of communication with human rights organizations and urban poor social movements, and put those two things together. So in other words, there are things that Davinder and Rose and people like them are hard-pressed to do because they're not a member state organization. Member state meaning they're not governed by a group of governments. And there are times when an alliance between us can generate a discussion in government circles that would be difficult for these movements to do by themselves. In other words, let's put it this way. If my board is made up of 50 governments and I seek as a representative of the UN to have a meeting with one of those governments, they have to treat me very seriously. In other words, it's not, I don't want to meet with the UN. It's not an option because in a sense they are contributing members to the United Nations. If not financially, they're represented in the governing structure. So we have an open door policy with those governments in ways that almost any other institution doesn't. I mean, that's one of the strengths of the UN that I think is not often recognized. The issue is, what do we do with that strength? Do we have a conversation with the government about a range of options that would be available to them to look at policy frameworks, government enablement, this kind of language that Rose is making fun of? Or do we engage in a discussion with them such that we're linking directly the efforts of the urban poor movements and human rights activists? So that in a sense, we're putting pressure, not telling them what to do, but indicating that there are options, there are these institutions, there are these movements, and therefore having a discussion about a range of options that would have not been there if those institutions didn't exist. And that discussion wouldn't have taken place if we weren't helping to deliver that message. And it's not that we solve all the problems, and many times we make mistakes, many times we worsen problems. But the issue is that we're entering into a discussion with our member states, our governing body, that is informed, in fact radically informed in my opinion, by our association with urban poor movements and human rights organizations. The trick for us internally is to find the balance. Because if we go very far and we overdo it with urban poor movements and human rights organizations, then our member states say, well, are you a member state organization or are you a activist organization? What is your function? And so in other words, you have to push the envelope. You have to walk that edge as a UN official in order to find that balance. And I think over time we've had a relationship with these organizations where we engage, as Rose has mentioned, and there are other examples with human rights organizations through the Special Rapporteur on housing rights. There's a huge discussion. We could get into that. Where they're actually represented in task forces and advisory boards, where they're informing what we do. And they're right at the table with the donor. In fact, they have as much power, sometimes more power than the donors.
Thank you. We have several questions. I'm going to take two questions at once. The woman in the back with her hand up, and the gentleman down here, and then we'll come back. Yes, right there, Allison.
Hi, my name is Lily Olson, and I'm a freshman at George Washington University. My question is directed at whoever would like to take it. I've really enjoyed hearing your presentations, and when I think of community organizing right now entering this city, I think about the huge disparities in economic wealth that exist right under our noses. And I'm wondering if you could provide insights or advice, as to how we could begin to combat these problems right in our local communities. Thank you.
And Allison, this gentleman right here, we're getting your microphone right now. Then we'll come up here, and then we'll go back to the floor.
My name is Mike McDonald, and we just held a U.S. Resilience Summit this fall, and we're in discussion with the Secretary General's office in the UN about a global resilience summit. Within those contexts, one of the key elements that we've been discussing is the possibility of trust networks. And I'm wondering, Davinder, if you might talk a little bit about the possibility of setting up trust networks in the reconciliation processes, not so much trying to ferret out where the crimes have been committed, but where are the opportunities for bridges that might transcend the historical injustices?
Okay. Anybody want to take the inequality question?
The first question.
Can
you repeat it in short for me?
Well, I think it's a rather large question of what can be done to begin to address the problems of inequality. Is that
economic?
Well, I'm speaking more specifically about D.C.
About D.C. Okay. Okay. Does anybody want to?
I don't know anything about D.C.
In a way, this is not a panel of people who know much about D.C., but maybe if you could say something about. Maybe if you could speak a little bit about the experience you've had in Karachi, because maybe there are some lessons that people in D.C. might think about. You began to talk about the Urban Research Center, and what are the kinds of places you would look at if you were coming to Washington?
I would have to get to know Washington first, which would take 20 years. No, I think I don't know about Washington, but in the cities I do know, in Asia mainly, the issue is land and the politics of land. And if land can be decommoditized, you will automatically have a more just and humane society. This is very important. If land use can be decided on the basis of environmental and social considerations and not on the basis of land use alone, land value alone, you are making a much healthier and a more prosperous society. I mean, I can't explain it because it will be a long explanation, but this is absolutely true. So how do you do that, I think, is one very big challenge, especially in this world of globalization, where land has acquired more value than it is really worth, because of speculation and the easy movement of capital from one place to another. In the case, I'll give you an example. In the case of Karachi and the other cities that I know, like Ho Chi Minh City, it's not very different. Massive investment from outside is coming in for real estate development. There's big capital desperately looking for a home where it can multiply. And in our case, the 14 kilometer of coastline in Karachi was to have an investment from Dubai and Malaysian companies of $68 billion US, which would push out fishing communities, which would take over this beach, which is used for recreation and entertainment, for condominiums, private beaches, clubs, hotels, etc. So there has been a very big movement, you might call it a civil society movement, of various sections of the population that have opposed this in a very big way. And the Urban Resource Center initiated this movement, but then it became a very big movement. And as a result, we have been able to get into the new Karachi Strategic Development Plan certain principles of development for the beach, which would protect the beach and the flora and fauna and the ecology of the area. Now, this requires research. It requires bringing various groups together. And in the world of today, it requires media support. And if you can manage that, I think you can challenge some aspects of this massive onslaught of capital, and to some extent the land issue. But the land issue is extremely complex. And I increasingly feel that if that issue can be tackled, which I don't see how it's going to be in the near future, you will have a happier world.
Davinder?
I don't know whether I should answer the question. The Washington capital.
Well, there was also the question.
The other one, second one.
If you have an observation about Washington.
Well, in the literature, it's called the apartheid city. So the economic disparities and the geography of it are extreme in Washington. So I think the question actually opens up a bigger question, and I'll just leave it at that. And at least in the conferences I've been, and Washington as a case of a divided city is a very well known and a documented case, and there are others. And also because who actually governs Washington? And there are many questions, but I don't want to dwell more on it because we don't have the time. But just to say that to Arif, I think for us Washington is in a good laboratory, not to be ignored, an important one. First of all, I'm afraid that I do not know enough about the concept of trust networks and enough about the summit. So I may not be able to answer or respond to your question intelligently on how trust networks can help in the reconciliation process. So I'll try and guess what you're talking about. So I may be off the mark. Well, you see, when we talk about transitional justice, it is transformative justice. And it's a bridge between a society, a nation, a country with a dark past. Imagine the times of the Civil War in the United States, and that gave birth to a new constitution. And that bridge is to take the same people together, no matter how painful it is, into a transformative process with justice and the types of justice, reparatory justice or administrative justice. All kinds of measures are to be taken so that you actually have a robust society. this is the aspiration of transitional justice. Because if you don't do it, then you will be dealing with this problematic for a very long time. And if you take the justice part out of it and only have truth, that means actually matter of fact what happened, organs of the state, private person, and others who actually committed gross violations of human rights on one side. And then say we reconcile. There are those lobbies around the world. And let's not go into justice, because justice is very troublesome. So you have to decide whether in your resilience model in dealing with societies in these kinds of transitions, whether you have justice at the center of it or not. If you do not have justice at the center of it, trust networks will not help. That's what has happened in South Africa. I hope that short answer is helpful to you. Now, in the design of a Truth Commission, I have worked on the design, is that you have a reconciliation component, you have a truth component where you actually get the facts, and those are testimonies, and a lot of them are legal information, the way you elicit them. And the other information is the justice function. How do you deal with questions of conditional amnesty and so on? Now, in the reconciliation part, the competences that you need are very different from the competences you need in the justice part and the truth part, where you collect a hell of a lot of testimonial data. Now, maybe trust networks can be a means, a tool in the reconciliation competences that you put together. So there is the need for different competences. And if trust networks is a tool that can provide a competence towards reconciliation in the total process, I would say that that can be explored. I don't know enough about it, but I would look at it from that perspective. And I keep asking is that I am not uncomfortable in terms of looking at resilience as an outcome, as kind of a dependent variable, okay? But not at the expense of not dispersing power, wealth, and well-being. Those are the goals. So we mustn't use the goals, confuse them with the outcomes. Now, if you can have those goals dispersed, met, have more equitable distribution of those values without becoming vulnerable, but by being resilient as an outcome, that means that you can continuously do that, right? Then I think we're beginning to make sense of this property of systems we call resilience. It's a property. It has to be a property of something. It doesn't exist in thin air. So that's the best I can do with your question, because I don't understand too much about the trust networks.
Okay, I think there are 4 questions left, so I'm going to take them. There are 5 questions left. 6 questions. So we're going to take 3 sets of pairs. This gentleman and back there, and then we'll answer those and come back to the room.
Yeah, Chachen, freelance correspondent. You are all well dedicated and you have mission and you do a good work. I would like to know, have you think about the sustainability of your work? And then second is Mr. Hasan responds to the question, and you talk about the politics of land. And I remember one time I'm in a discussion of water in Pakistan, and have a suggestion in order to have better water use, Pakistan have to have a land reform. Thank you.
Any takers on either question? The sustainability of your own work and also...
I think sustainability, if it means the continuation of that work and the relevance of that work, I think it will change over time. Society will change, conditions will change, and so I think the nature of the work will also change. About continuity, I can say that we have no problems. There is a younger generation that has already taken over. I am quite redundant, except managing the meeting of the board every 3 months. And I think they are very creative And they are creative because of the culture that I spoke of. That culture is important. If that culture dies, then I think their relationship with their work and with the communities that they work with will also die.
Okay, we're going to take Caroline, and the woman in the middle of the room will come back, and then we still have 3 questions left.
I'm Caroline Kihato from the University of South Africa, located in Pretoria. My question is to Davinder about some of the issues that you've raised. I really appreciate the fact that you begin by prefacing your identity as a Kenyan and locating your roots to the sort of historical colonial imperialism. And in your talk, you said that in order to build a national identity, we need to sort of forge across ethnic lines. And I'm wondering whether how you build a national identity with all the problems that it can create, as we have known it historically, without erasing ethnicity, which is a very important part of people's everyday life and identity. And the other question that I wanted to ask, lived through this violence and which had neighbors that were from other ethnic groups, managed to avoid violence.
Okay, and before we answer, we'll take the woman right in the center of the room. We have a microphone behind you.
As I was sitting here, I was trying to think of all the different presentations and think about what communities and resilience kind of mean together. And I think there are multiple different types of resilience and resistance. And one of the things that I think came most strongly was the idea that communities have agency over their own circumstances. And then I started thinking, well, what is the role of government? Shouldn't government be providing some sort of support, whether it's national or local government? And that kind of led me to a question regarding decentralization. Obviously, decentralization is something that's very strong. I guess maybe in the last 10 to 15 years, there's been a tremendous focus on it. And I guess the presumption is that because local governments have a greater proximity to local communities, then that means that they must know more, be more in touch, perhaps will be more accountable because they're located in the places where these communities will hopefully kind of demand, I guess, different types of services, including housing, including water, et cetera. And my question about decentralization is, with this focus on local governments, why does it seem there's still a lack of performance? And I think, particularly in the work of organizations that are doing international development work, I'm with the Urban Institute, the issue of capacity is always raised. And I just find it hard to believe that there's always a lack of capacity at the local level. The idea is that maybe because they're not at the national or central government, they haven't had the proper training, the proper expertise. And I feel that if they've been working with communities, they must know what communities need. So I was wondering if you all might be able to locate other areas or other issues that might be the culprit other than capacity. Perhaps it's an issue of corruption or something else. Maybe it's perhaps an issue of what type of participation is actually occurring and what types of participation need to occur. So that's it.
Davinder, why don't you take the question first, and maybe someone else, or if you want, you can answer. We talked about decentralization a lot, so maybe someone.
The question you asked whether there were examples of community resilience where the neighbors came to help each other of different distinct ethnies living together. Yes, there were some instances, but they were rare. Now, the resiliency came not so much from government in the first instance, because the police and the army intervened very late, is what in my paper I refer to as redundancy. That means is ways of coping by a system, and some part of it is very badly impacted, came from ties, came from their own ethnic ties. For instance, in Nairobi, people who had been displaced from the Rift Valley province had actually been housed by even not relatives, people who knew them from a distance, in their homes, in middle income homes, in their gardens, in tents, and so on. So the help that came, the backup, came from within those communities, wherever they were. And it was much later that the help came from outside. This is very interesting. In other words, where did that backup come from? Of course, then there was the camps, and the government came in with help, and so on. Okay, there were very few instances. Now, the interesting thing is in the slums of Nairobi, where people had been organized and working together in different kinds of ways, there were actually conflicts there. Okay, because different ethnic groups. Let's say in Korogocho, which you know, Kikuyu and the Luos. The Kikuyus are the shack owners. These are people who own shacks who are absent. It is a kind of a commercial settlement through period of corruption. You know, Nairobi slums are gold mines. We haven't talked about that part of the story because people inside the slums don't tell you these stories. They tell you other side of the stories. And these are gold mines. So there are absentee landlords, 20 shacks, 30 shacks. They don't live there. They collect rent. They have bouncers going around. So the people from the other ethnic group, the one that felt that they were aggrieved through the disputed presidential election, took over those shacks. You know, these are the same groups that CBOs and NGOs and the others that organized together, and honestly, they haven't asked themselves this question, is that if we organize these people and we're telling the rest of the world that there is a cohesion here and they were after each other's blood, okay, how do you explain that? How do you explain that? Now, so coming back to this question that no, of course not. Ethnicity becomes a problem in African politics when in the power domain, in the political domain, because accumulation of power, either concentration of power through imperial presidencies or by a certain ethnic group means is that power is then converted into wealth, which is converted into the well-being either of the elite or generally of a community, right? So this is where the identity becomes a political problem. Outside of the power arena, if you're in other arenas, it's not an issue. So I'm not saying that ethnicity is what we call negative ethnicity, which is a problem, but ethnicity can be positive.
Any observations on decentralization? Well, we talked about that quite a bit, and if there are other people in the room who can correct my sort of overview, but I think there were at least 3 points to be made. First off, decentralization has to be more than transferring obligations without transferring assets. So that if you're devolving obligations, there has to be some way of devolving the creation of assets as well. Or all that is happening is that a government is tossing off obligations. Secondly, there are very serious issues of crime and accountability, and we just heard Davinder talk about absentee landlords and the whole issue of crime and corruption is a real one, and that leads to, I think, what we felt was really important is the importance of accountability in very real ways, which is a governance issue. And that decentralization without an expansion of the means for accountability is like decentralization of transferring obligations and not resources. It doesn't get you very far. There has to be meaningful forms of accountability which have to do with governance structures. I think that's sort of where we came out. We have 3 final questions. I'm going to take them at once. Jeff DeBelko in the back, this gentleman here. Actually, we'll take Jeff, the woman next to him, the gentleman here, and we'll wrap up. And we have a reception for those of you who have hung on this long. Jeff?
Thank you very much. I don't want to get in the way of the reception. Jeff DeBelko here at the Wilson Center. Thank you all for your insights this afternoon and for the 2 days. I think it's appropriate that we heard some of the comments that were really focused on the relationship that is imprecisely called donor and recipient, and in part just those terms suggest some of the problems that you've identified in those relationships. So I think it's appropriate we had that discussion in the building that has and houses U.S. Agency for International Development, and it was pleasing to me to see some of those folks here and hopefully taking on some of those messages. I'd like to ask you about what has been characterized by some as a different model or a trend in the form of the practices of a new donor or a donor that's newly prominent in many parts of the world, including some of your own, and that's the role of China as one that, at least by some accounts, has fewer of some of these very heavy-handed conditionality aspects to it, with less focus on being very directive. So grants, less directive of what money is to be used for, less focus on evaluation, and some of the onerous things that you identified as being counterproductive in that funding relationship. So, but that's a broad sketch, and of course things are going to be very different in very context. But your thoughts on whether this is a different model, or just maybe looks more different than it actually is, and how you've seen this playing out in ways that may be more or less constructive, given some of the critiques you've suggested and ways forward to make this partnership rather than a one-way street in terms of that donor relationship.
Okay, and if you can hand the microphone right there.
Hi, Sheridan Jones-McRae, independent NGO facilitator. My question actually piggybacks the previous one and relates to the expectations of funders. Now, I'm a big believer of the community itself being able to steer its own development, not dancing to the tune of donors. But looking backwards, I'm also understanding that this requirement from donors has come from past cases of misuse of funds from various entities. So I guess I want to ask, how do we get to a situation where that misuse of funds is not used as a justification to why donors can dictate how funds are spent and accounted for? It would seem that it's a process of both partners getting together equally and negotiating what are fair and reasonable terms on accounting and using for those funds. I'm actually wondering, do any of you have any examples of successful processes where that's been done, or any recommendations on future approaches that we could be taking? Thanks.
Okay, and this gentleman down here, Allison, will have the final question.
Hi, my name is Robin Rajak. I'm with the World Bank. As rich as the discussions have been, there's a sort of risk of leaving the room thinking that in all cases, the more local, the better. My question really is, what do you want from government? And what, of all the obstacles, what is it that they think about you and the communities that you represent that you think hinders them or keeps them from delivering that?
Well, these are four big questions, and maybe we can actually just start with Davinder and move this way, and we'll wrap up. So, Davinder, do you want to take a crack at any of these questions?
I want to talk about the politics of donor-donee relation. Donors have often liked to work with authoritarian regimes because you then have to work with one dictator. You don't need to consult everybody else, and it's very, very easy. And I don't want to go into a lot of history of that. And that's not different from China. China is highly centralized. There's less questioning of what China does within the Chinese system, and also who they do it with. It's no different from what has happened in the past. When a system becomes more democratic, when the citizens demand more accountability, then you want your legislatures, that you want the Congress to really to have a debate, to discuss the relationships, to discuss what is coming, to know what it is for exactly. Those things don't happen in many of the developing countries and the African countries. So there are certain weaknesses inside which become advantages for the outsiders things. I think the question about corruption and how funds are used or misused and so on, well, it's kind of paradoxical that in my country we have a lot of anti-corruption statutory units, and they take up a hell of a lot of money. Now, in order to stop corruption, why should you have all these units? That is because normal systems have failed to work, so you create alternative systems. That is on our side of the story. And then we say as well, then the debt we have, okay, were actually the bad loans you made. is no different from the bad loans made by the banks, right? So why penalize the populations when you dealt with dictatorships, made bad loans? Now you want to penalize the populations. So there are many types of debates around them, and just to finish off finally on what do we want from the governments? We want the governments to be our servants and not our masters.
Yeah, I would like to say that on the side of the organization where I belong, we want the donors to trust us. They don't have trust the poor communities. So if ever they can change their mindset and start to trust the people, then their money will be safe. They are trusting the people with big systems that are complicated. Then at the end of the day, the money disappears. The communities are having very simple and straightforward systems, and they don't trust it. So there's lack of trust amongst the donors and the communities. I was giving an example that the Bill Gates that is here in America started to try their luck to say, let's just test, like dipping the, what do we call, by giving us $10 million without any contract, without any strings attached. They just said, we are giving you this. We are creating trust. If other donors can learn what the Bill Gates has done to SDI, maybe we can change the systems. As Davinder is saying, we are suffering the consequences of the people who have done the mistakes. We are not those people. We have learned also from those mistakes to put our systems properly. So why can't they test the systems that we have come up with? So that is why there's such a lot of tension. Because at the end of the day, yes, they won't get the report, because the report, you can't report to say, I bought 5 Mercedes-Benz and I have bought 20 computers, but there's no single house on the ground. It's difficult to report on that. But with us, we say, we have built 100 houses, 1 computer, no car. We use taxi and train to go to different communities. So if they can create that trust, and then with our government, it's the same. Because the funding agencies are the same as our government locally. They don't have trust in the communities. They don't believe that what the communities are doing can benefit them as the government. So that's why we are always saying we want to forge the partnership with them, so that we create initiatives on the ground, so that they should see what we are doing in order for them to be convinced to support them. So lack of trust is the only thing. If we can really create that trust, we will solve the problem. Can
Pablo?
I go to the loop?
Pablo? Yeah. Thank you. One of the reasons I like coming to these conferences, I get to hear all these fantastic words and fantastic ideas that seem to encapsulate what we have been trying to accomplish. And one of the words and ideas that I heard was social cultural infrastructure. For us, this is our core culture. Our core culture was based on trust. Love, faith, hope, charity, we all find that in the sacred fire, and it's all based on trust. So I guess, if I'm going to say anything about what's been happening, then we have to look at what is the core culture of American society. Life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. That's what they gave us. And what we're doing is taking away that ability to create life, that ability to live free and pursue our own happiness. I know it becomes difficult in a very diverse society, but if we can transfer these ideas into our ability to allow people to find what they need, live a fulfilled life, then I think we're moving in the right direction as a society. because we're all Americans. We're all sitting here, but we're all human beings, and we're a society of human beings that belong to the earth. And we have to find something that transcends not only just these boundaries, but all the boundaries of the world.
Arif? I think we ended on the right note. So we'll let Pablo have the last word. Thank you all very much. Please, since you've stayed, the reward is across the hall. Thank you.